I was going to ask about Kingdom, actually, because I think some of the people on the panel here have seen it.
Yeah, I've seen it.
I haven't yet.
I was curious to know what your thoughts are on it, because from what Muller told me, you're quite well up on the Planet of the Apes movies, like at least the remake ones.
I like them. I like the remake movies actually like a good deal. I probably like them more than they actually, like good. Those films have their flaws. Like they do have their problems with the writing, but I think that those films get carried by Caesar. I really like Caesar. I really, really like Andy Serkis's performance as Caesar. I like the idea of the character, watching a trilogy where you see Caesar basically eventually become a man, like and have like that gradual transformation manifest in a variety of different ways, like from the way he talks, the way he walks, the way he interacts with the world and grapples with the world. Like that's really cool. This Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes is kind of dull, unfortunately, which is like that's a shame. But I don't know that I was like super. I wasn't like highly anticipating this film. But yeah, it just comes across as like kind of like a dull continuation that when you compare it to those films, it's like it's lacking. Along with having a lot of the standard, like contrivances galore, and the characters are just not interesting enough to make up for it. They're fine, but nothing more than that.
I mean, I was going to say, because it really felt like the third movie brought this whole storyline to a close. Like, they led the apes to, like, whatever their new home was going to be. The humans have been defeated. Caesar passes on the legacy to his son and then dies. That's it. That's your story wrapped up there. I guess I'm kind of confused as to where the narrative now goes.
I would say that the pitch for this film is fine on its face. It's the idea that we're moving, like 200, 300 years later to a world that is much more, post-apocalypse. The apes are, thriving in a sense, and humanity is kind of like, it seems like it's basically barely exists anymore. The idea of seeing an ape society that's like much larger and more organized. There's ideas there that are worthwhile, but I mean, I'd say the film dedicates like a lot of time to not exploring these ideas. It takes a long time before you actually get to what seems like the pitch of the film is. What does it look like when you have, a much more organized like society of apes that have like these grander objectives in the world? But it's just not that present for most of it. It is kind of just like a dull adventure across the land. Before that happens, and it's all just strung together by, again, like a really long string of contrivances of like, man, if these characters showed up 5 minutes earlier or 5 minutes later, the whole movie doesn't happen over and over and over again.
Right. So it's not. So Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, I thought it was going to be more like a callback to the original Heston Planet of the Apes. It's not.
It's very much like a continuation of the story of the reboot series. Okay. It's kind of like, you can almost view it. It's kind of like in the realm of soft reboots that we've had recently. You could watch this one without watching the reboot trilogy or the original films, and you'd be fine. But it definitely, to some extent, relies upon what happened in the reboot trilogy for its existence. Okay. But that's kind of the problem. Is like when you're watching the film, I'm just thinking like, man, these characters, I just don't find them as interesting as the characters that were in the reboot trilogy. Is this like the protagonist of what's that? Sorry.
I know. I'm going to ask a question, but I'll wait till you're finished.
Oh, I was just going to say that I found like if you were to do a parallel between each of the new characters that have been introduced in this film, it's hard not to compare them to the ones that came before. And each time it's just like, man, you're not as interesting. Like the protagonist in this one, Noah, he's not as interesting as Caesar. He hasn't had as much time as Caesar, but I'd say that even Caesar in the first film, Rise of the Planet of the Apes, like even in that one, Caesar is pretty fascinating. And then it's the same for the new villain in this one, Proximus. He isn't as interesting to me as Koba. You can even do the comparison between the orangutans in the film. The one that they have here, I don't like him as much as Maurice. Maurice was like the big orangutan, really chill, friendly guy. And it's like, yeah, each time I draw a comparison between those characters, I think, man, it's not that you're bad, it's just that you're not as interesting. You don't have as much, flesh to them as characters.
Is this an attempt to kick off a new trilogy then, do you think?
I think so. Yes,
Right.
very much baits a continuation of the story. In a sense, it's like complete, but it's definitely baiting a series. And I imagine at this point, because remember, this is Disney now. This isn't Fox anymore. This is 20th Century Studios, so Disney. I imagine there's definitely a desire to turn it into a franchise, especially if it does well, which I think it probably will. But I get the impression it's going to be a very forgettable film. I would just be surprised, like if general audiences came away from it feeling like particularly satisfied. Funnily enough, when I was walking out of the theater, there was a guy behind me who was talking to his wife, and then she was like, "What'd you think of it?" And he said it was boring, and I thought, like, yeah, I could see people coming away feeling it's boring. It's for a 2.5-hour film, it doesn't achieve much.
Right.
Did it feel more like a television series, like it would stream better?
I don't know. I think I think it could have worked as a film with stronger characterization and a tighter plot and a greater degree of focus on, I guess what you would say is like the thematic elements that you can draw from this world. But it's just it is not an expeditious story. It does not use its time particularly well. It doesn't use it like terribly. But it feels like they could have achieved a lot more with the characters and the premise in the time that they had.
In terms of the human characters, are they still afflicted with that weird virus thing that stops them from talking and stuff, or have they gotten past that? Is this?
So that's kind of the interesting thing about the film. In a certain sense, it feels like it progresses the world, but in another sense, it feels like it resets it. It's like you said, it felt like the conflict was kind of done in War for the Planet of the Apes, that it was kind of over, but now it's like being reset in a sense that there is you've got there are humans around, but most of them can't speak except for a couple of them. And that's kind of like the cell. So you've got one human character who's joining them on their adventures. And it was kind of interesting when I was thinking about the film. I was wondering, man, a lot of what was potent in the reboot trilogy was the interactions between like Caesar and the apes with humans and the conflict. Yeah. And so in the absence of that, you need to replace it with something that's stronger. And I don't feel like they did a particularly good job of doing that with the new like ape society that they created. They didn't feel like a good replacement for the interactions with human characters, especially with the differences between the interactions with the human characters in the reboot. Because the first film was when it was still modern society. And then in Dawn, it was now post-apocalypse, but it was still it was like a civilian society that was in some sense armed. And then the third film, it was basically an army.
Yeah. It's a strange franchise, the Planet of the Apes reboot. Like, on the one hand, I think it's one I overlook as an example of a pretty good reboot of an old series, because the original, like the very first Planet of the Apes, okay, that was a great movie. Everyone remembers the twist. That was fantastic. They made many sequels, and most of them were pretty shit and quite forgettable, and we'd probably rather forget them. So this trilogy is interesting in that it remained fairly strong throughout the first three movies. Like they had their issues, but like generally, I think they were quite good films. I was just never invested in them personally. It was a weird experience where I was watching them, recognizing like, hey, as a technical achievement, this is remarkable. Like the performances are fantastic. The motion capture is excellent. Caesar's a well-developed, very interesting character. I just never quite got into them. I was never really that bothered for them. I watched them and then just kind of moved on. So it's kind of an unusual thing.
Kind of approach them. I think it's Caesar, like and Andy Serkis, like portraying that character, as well as the meta, right? Of isn't it cool that you have this actor who is managing to be very convincing in this role, and then also the conversation about whether he should have been nominated for that, like in some sort of category, right, for best actor, but not interested in doing that for people who do motion capture for whatever reason. But yeah, I think they're viewed favorably, but it doesn't seem like they've made a huge impact. And I think this film will make far less of one.
Yeah. What's interesting to me about the Apes franchise is when I was a kid, the two franchises pre-Star Wars that I love the most were Bond and Apes. And the Apes franchise, you didn't know about the diminishing qualities. I mean, if you go back and watch the R-rated version of Conquest of the Planet of the Apes, it's pretty amazing from today's perspective. That's the fourth film. But what I really liked about the reboot trilogy is that it didn't Like you can watch the original Planet of the Apes, and then maybe you could watch all 3 of this new trilogy, and then watch, say, Beneath the Planet of the Apes, and it works beautifully. They dovetail very nicely into the original 5 films, which I think is pretty interesting because this is a franchise that's been around since '68, and the 5 original Planet of the Apes movies had a lot of social commentary. I think today people would scream that they were woke, even though at the time they really, I mean, when you watch Conquest and you've got Caesar calling for revolution, and you watch the R-rated version, it's pretty amazing to watch that. And this is what we were watching. Hey kids, watch the Go Ape Festival this week on whatever TV channel, and you'd watch these 5 films, and I'm watching them at 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, and I'm like, these are the greatest movies ever. And I had no idea what a lot of the subtext of what was going on, which is not exactly.
I just want to. I remember watching the War for the Planet of the Apes. I think that's the one set in the future where the humans try to retake the world. And the ape army's going off to battle, and there's literally apes standing there with like placards saying like "No war" or "End the war now." Yes. It's like, okay, the political allegories here are fucking heavy-handed, man.
Yeah, like, they really are. And that was the movie that was made because kids. That was really a movie that was, believe it or not, Battle for the Planet of the Apes was made for kids, and it was made with not very much money because kids loved apes. I've always said there's the only thing better than dinosaurs for kids is apes on horseback with rifles shooting humans. And I firmly stand by that.
I like how in all this discussion, nobody's acknowledged Tim Burton's Planet of the Apes.
That was wretched.
So bad.
The only thing I remember from that was Estella Warren just being really fucking hot. Like, yes. I don't think she went on to great things either. Not, I don't know. Maybe she was like the Sydney Sweeney of her time or something. We didn't quite appreciate her.